ordering guitar knobs with factory engraved indication lines would make life a lot easier when it comes to making the knobs. But we're not about doing things easy, so we're going to start with these more blank models and engrave our own indication marks. We'll need to drill a bigger hole into the guitar knobs, so to not damage the grub screws and their threads, we will back the grub screws out. And so as to not damage and scrape the outside of the guitar knobs, we are using this shop rag. We've doubled it up, and I don't want it to be tight underneath the guitar knob. I put a little pocket underneath so that when we drill through, it won't catch the shop rag and twist up. The first guitar knob, we're only making the hole bigger. The second one, we will drill all the way through. And what I'm not showing you in this video is I had to go back after this and kind of wallow it around with the same 1/4 inch drill bit just to make it, to give it a bit more room for the C-clip / spring roll to fit in more easily. Now we'll be making an adapter out of the spring roll or C-clip, C-pin, whatever it's called, into the knob that we did not drill through, which will end up being the tension knob. We pushed the clip all the way in and made a mark. This is where we're going to be making our cut. Now we're holding it up next to the knob, and that's where the grub screw is. So I'm going to be making a mark because we need to grind out a section so that the grub screw will go through this roll, this pin, and clamp down onto our tension rod. This is what we're looking for. It's not pretty, but it will be hidden inside the knob. The very bottom of it, you will be able to see a bit, so we'll file that smooth and test to see that it works well. And you know it works well if it holds on to the injection pin / tension rod. And it did. So now we'll move on to our picking tip knob. There's excess material, so we'll hold it up next to it. We want the cutout section of it to be underneath, but we don't need that extra, so we'll make a mark there. And this is where we're going to cut it. And then we'll file it smooth because we will also be able to see the section that we cut afterwards. So we don't want it to be too jagged. So now we've cut it off where we want it to be. We'll install it in the picking knob and test that the tension rod moves freely inside of it. Make sure there's no burrs that we need to sand in or file out. It looks pretty smooth. Now it's fairly obvious I didn't shoot this tutorial in one continuous take. So in this I'm using a an injection pin for the tension rod and tension tip. And you can see it hasn't been grinded down to be the tension tip, but if you're following along, yours would be closer to complete here. But this works for the illustration that I need, or the demonstration, should I say. Here we let the picking tip go down to the shelf of the tension rod, and we are making a mark at the top of the knob, the picking knob, because when it is here in this position, this will be where it is where the picking tip is meeting the lowest disc that it'll need to pick. So we'll have an indication. This will be the beginning of our indicator marks, and will be important to know that when you've got the pick actually in a lock, that you're all the way to the bottom. All the way to the bottom for the picking tip would be disc 10, whereas the tension tip would be on disc 11. Before this, you can see I on a piece of paper I drew marks, indication marks, every 2 millimeters, and I made 10 marks for the 10 discs and the indication lines that we will need to engrave onto the rod. So here I am, I've marked the 10 indication marks on the tension rod, and we'll need that later. Here we'll be figuring out just how much we want to trim off the top of the tension rod so that it's not so long. If you get too long of a pick, which is decided by the length of the tension rod, I feel like it can wobble a bit more. It's not as stable, so I like to trim it down a little bit shorter. When you get a little wobble, you're more likely to slip off discs. So this is as high as we should need to go with the picking tip based on the indication line. That should be the highest, or disc 1. And then with the tension knob there, we can see the excess, and we might even want to add a few centimeters, or millimeters, so that we can actually look down into the marks we'll have on the picking knob to let us know which position it's in. Hey!
Oh, I'm so sorry, babe. I was in my head and I forgot.
Everything seems to be working pretty well. I mean, you know, imagine that injection pin is actually a finished tension rod. Now we'll be making our indication marks for the picking tip. First, I'll try to draw a line straight down the center, lined up with the same direction that the picking tip is, because when the picking tip is actually in the lock, you can't see the orientation necessarily. After I make that line across, I will make a half moon or a U shape, mimicking the actual shape of the picking tip. Personal preference. It's just an indication. So again, I know the orientation of the picking tip when it's embedded in the lock. And I didn't mention earlier, this is the etching tip on the Dremel. Now it's time to make the same indication engraving on the tension knob. This one isn't as important to line up at this point, and we'll get to that later, but well, I'll explain it now. Later on we'll grind a section of the knob in, but on the rod itself, so that the grub screw doesn't slip around on it. So if we don't get this perfectly lined up, this is something we can adjust on one of the last steps. And it should look something like this. That works.